Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa sallallahu wa sallama ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. In the previous lesson, we studied propositions. We saw that there's two kinds of propositions, namely categorical and conditional propositions. And we saw that a propositional is a composite expression that can be true or false. We explained the difference between categorical and conditional propositions, and we saw that categorical propositions are simple propositions, meaning they are composed of a subject and a predicate, whereas conditional propositions are composite propositions, meaning that they are composed of more than one categorical propositions. The question that this explanation led us to at the end of the previous lesson was, what does it mean for a proposition to be true? And that is the topic of this lesson. This isn't something that Athiruddin al-Abhari explicitly addressed in his primer on Islamic logic, but it is something that's discussed in more advanced text of Islamic logic. The material that we will be studying in this lesson is normally studied in the intermediate or final stages of a student's study of logic, but for several reasons that will become clear as this course progresses, understanding this topic in our times, understanding this topic clearly in our times is important for a student of the Islamic sciences, particularly for a student of theology. So the scholars, they say, the scholars of Islamic logic, they say that a proposition is true when its predication corresponds to reality, and it's false when its predication does not correspond to reality. In order to understand this explanation of what it means for a proposition to be true and what it means for a proposition to be false, we need to understand what exactly is meant by a predication and what exactly is meant by reality. Let's take an example, and as we go through this example, we want to put in our minds three questions. What is a proposition? What is a predication? And what is reality? So if we take the example, Zaid is standing, this is a proposition. It's a proposition because it's a composite expression that can be true or it can be false. It's composed of three elements that are obvious to us. The first element is something called the subject. Zaid is the subject of the proposition. The second element is standing, or someone who is standing. This proposition is saying that Zaid is someone who is standing. Someone who is standing is the predicate. And the third part is the word is. And the word is, we saw in the previous lesson, is called a copula, and it signifies the predication. In Arabic, we don't have copulas. The word is does not exist in propositions in the Arabic language. There's simply the subject and the predicate. But remember that logic is describing the mental language, and this mental language is independent of English or Arabic. And in our mental language, we have a subject, we have a predicate, and we have a predication. And this predication has something that is called a modality. Together, these four elements make up every proposition. These four elements are the integral elements that constitute every single proposition. And in order to understand clearly and precisely what exactly a proposition is doing, what exactly a proposition is saying, we need to keep in mind what the subject is, what the predicate is, what the predication is, and what the modality is. Now, modality is probably one of the most important topics of logic to a theologian in our times. And there's a branch of logic called modal logic, which has taken off in Western philosophy in recent years. And modal logic was something that was studied by the Muslim logicians centuries before the Western logicians, and they did a far better job at it. And they have a very advanced modal logic. Inshallah, when we study and take an intermediate or advanced level course on Islamic logic following this, and once we've done a little bit of theology to see the importance of modality, we will cover modality from the perspective of a logician in great detail. But for now, we're just going to touch on it. It's not something that Athiruddin al-Abhari mentions in his text, But since it is an integral part of a proposition, we're going to touch on it, but we're not going to dwell on it very much. I just want you to have an idea of what a modality is and why it's important. So we'll be focusing on predication. So what is it? What is a predication? Well, in order to understand what a predication is, this is how the scholars of Islamic logic, they explain the predication. They said that the subject in the proposition, there's something called a subject concept. What's the subject concept? It's the concept of Zayd that exists in the mind. So there is an actual Zayd outside the mind, and there is a concept in the mind of Zayd that represents that actual Zayd outside the mind. The concept in the mind is called the subject concept. Similarly, there's something called a predicate concept. The predicate concept here is someone who is standing, a stander. So in our mind, we have the concept of Zayd, and we have the concept of someone who is standing. We use the concept of Zayd, the subject concept, to get our hands on something called the referent. So the subject concept in the mind has a referent. What is the referent? What does it refer to? What does it represent? It refers to the actual Zayd, the actual person Zayd who exists outside the mind. And when we say that Zayd is standing, what we are saying is that the referent of the subject concept, the thing that the subject concept refers to, is characterized by the predicate concept. In other words, that thing is someone who is standing. So the role of the subject concept is to get your hands on a referent. And the role of the predicate concept is to say that that referent is characterized by the predicate concept. This predication is. A predication says that the thing that the subject concept refers to is characterized by the predicate concept. And if in reality the referent is characterized by the predicate concept, then we say that the proposition is true. And if in reality the referent is not characterized by the predicate concept, then we say that the proposition is false. This is what a predication is, this is what it means to be true, and this is what it means to be false. Now, there's this other aspect called modality, which I'm just going to briefly introduce so you can conceive of it. Let's say that this proposition is in fact true. Let's say that Zayd is indeed standing. The truth of this proposition has a quality, has an attribute, and that is the attribute of possibility. So if it's true, we perceive that it's possibly true, meaning even if it's true that Zayd is standing, then it's possible for him to not have been standing. And if it's false that Zayd is standing, then it's possibly false, meaning that it's possible for it to be true. He could have been standing. So in this case, we say that there is a subject, there's a predicate, Zayd, and someone who is standing. There's a predication, we say Zayd is standing. We just explained what a predication is. And there is a reality. And when the proposition is true, in reality it is possibly true, and if it's false, in reality it's possibly false. In the predication, we could assert that in the predication that it is possibly true, and if we assert in the predication that it's possibly true and it is actually possibly true, then the proposition is true. But we could assert in the predication that this is necessarily true. And if we assert that it's necessarily true, meaning it's not possible for it not to be true, then if Zayd is actually standing, the proposition would actually be false because it's only possibly true in reality. So keep this idea of modality in your mind. We'll touch on it several times in this course. I just want you to get a conception of it. The modality is actually an integral part of the proposition, but it's not something that we want to spend too much time on in this lesson because it can quickly get very complicated. Let's take another example of a proposition. This proposition is frequently mentioned in books of Islamic theology, in Kalam, that every contingent thing is made by a necessary being. So the things of the universe are all contingent things. The sun is a contingent thing, the moon is a contingent thing, The stars are contingent things. I'm a contingent thing. Everything in the universe is contingent. What it means for it to be contingent is that it needs is that it could have been otherwise. So the sun could have been different. It could have had different qualities. It could not have existed. I could have been different. I could have had different qualities. I could also not have existed. So whenever you have any contingent thing that we perceive can be some other way, then it needs something else to make it the way that it is. And that other thing that makes it the way that it is must be a necessary being. It itself cannot be contingent, because otherwise you would have to ask the same question about that thing. What made it the way that it is? And if you only had contingent things, then you would have an infinite regress, and an infinite regress of contingent things does not explain, cannot be an adequate or sufficient cause or explanation for the contingent things that we see around us. This, very briefly, is one of the arguments for the existence of God that is covered in books of Islamic theology in Kalam. The details of it we'll get to when we take a course in Kalam. But for now, this is a proposition that's part of this argument, that every contingent thing is made by a necessary being. Like the previous proposition, this proposition consists of a subject concept and a predicate concept. The subject concept is contingent thing, and the predicate concept is something that is made by a necessary being. We use the subject concept to identify a referent, namely the contingent things of the universe, every contingent thing, in other words, everything in the physical universe, every contingent thing. And when we state this proposition, we assert that every contingent thing, the reference of the subject concept, is characterized by the concept of being made by a necessary being. This is the predication of the proposition, and if this predication corresponds to reality, meaning that in reality every contingent thing is made by a necessary being, then it's true, and if it doesn't, then it's false. Now, in books of Islamic theology, they demonstrate through a series of arguments, simple arguments, that this is in fact true. However, the truth of this proposition is different than the truth of the previous proposition. This proposition is not only true, but it's necessarily true, meaning that its being true in the real world has a quality of necessity, and that quality of necessity is called the proposition's or the predication's modality. And so in the previous proposition, the modality was a modality of possibility. In this proposition, the modality is a modality of necessity. So this is the propositions that we've taken so far, both examples, they talk about things in the world. Zayd, or contingent things, or a necessary being. A necessary being is not in the world. Necessary being, namely Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, made the universe. However, like the things of the world, it's something that exists. It actually exists, has a higher level of existence because it exists necessarily. But propositions don't need to talk about metaphysical things that exist in the world. We often make statements about things that don't exist in the world, about concepts. So here's an example. This is taken from another science, Islamic science, the science of hadith criticism or hadith authentication. And a scholar of that science would say that hadiths that have reliable transmitters are authentic. There's several other conditions in order for a hadith to be authentic, genuine, in other words, a true transmission of something that happened in the past. But just for the purposes of illustration, let's work with this one condition. So let's say that hadith that have reliable transmitters are authentic. This is a proposition. This proposition has a subject concept and a predicate concept. The subject concept is hadiths that have reliable transmitters. The predicate concept is being something that is authentic, something that is genuine, something that truly conveys information about something that happened in the past. We use the subject concept to identify a referent. So the concept of hadiths that have reliable transmitters, it identifies a collection of hadiths. So there are some hadiths that have reliable transmitters. There are other hadiths whose transmitters are not reliable. So let's put all of the hadiths that have reliable transmitters together and use the subject concept, hadiths that have reliable transmitters, to get at those hadiths. These hadiths, this proposition is asserting, are genuine. They are authentic. They truly describe what happened in the past. So this is the predication. If this is true, if it's true that hadith that have reliable transmitters are authentic, if this is true extra propositionally, meaning outside the proposition, meaning it's speaking in reality, it's talking about a reality. However, hadiths are not things that exist like Zayd walking around in the world, or contingent things like the sun that you look up and see in the sky. But nevertheless, this is a statement, it's a proposition. So this illustrates that reality doesn't have to be metaphysical, and reality can be, you can be talking about concepts, but the process of predication and truth and falsehood, it's the same. This is how we think. And so all of the Islamic sciences, they study a collection of propositions. So this is an example of a proposition that you would find in the science of hadith authentication. Hadith that have reliable transmitters are authentic, and the science of hadith authentication would consist of dozens, maybe hundreds of other propositions that a student of that science will study. And when he studies that science, he takes that proposition and then he studies why it's true. What's the evidence for its being true? How can I infer that this is true? All of the Islamic sciences, they study a collection of propositions in this manner, and then they study why they're true, inferential propositions. And that's why logic is important. That's why it's important to know exactly what it means for a proposition to be true or false. So this here, it's not what I'm describing here, and what the scholars of Islamic logic, they describe. It's not some kind of obscure philosophy. This is actually how we think, and we use it in all aspects of our thought. This is what we mean when we say that a proposition is true. So remember, we were going through these examples with these questions in our mind. What is a proposition? What is a predication? And what is reality? And with these illustrative examples, we should now have a good idea of what a proposition is, what a predication is, and what reality is. So a proposition asserts that the referent of the subject concept is characterized by the predicate concept. So a proposition consists of a subject and a predicate, and the subject and the predicate, they refer to the expression, the words of the subject and the word of the predicate refers to a concept in the mind. The subject concept for the subject expression, and the predicate concept for the predicate expression. The subject concept, it refers to a thing that is outside the proposition. Outside the proposition, meaning it's talking about something other than the subject concept. It's being used. The subject concept is a tool that's used to get at a referent. That referent could be something that exists outside the mind, walks around like Zayd, or it could be a concept, another concept. So the subject concept, it gets at some referent, and when the predication of the proposition asserts that the referent is characterized by the predicate concept. And if in reality, if the referent is extra propositionally, what I mean by extra propositionally is really, in reality, the reality is extra propositional. This is an important point. That's probably the key point that you should take away from this lesson. That we're not just equating. What I'm showing is that we're not just, when you state a proposition, when you assert a proposition, you're not simply saying that the subject is the predicate. No, you're using the subject to get at a thing, and you're saying that thing is characterized by the predicate, and that thing is it is something that is outside the proposition, and there is an extra propositional state of affairs which, if the predication of the proposition corresponds to that extra propositional state of affairs, then the proposition is true, otherwise it's false. And that extra propositional state of affairs, which could be something that walks around like Zaid, or it could be some other concept in the mind. That is what we mean by reality. So if the referent of the subject concept is extra propositionally characterized by the predicate concept, then we say the proposition is true. Otherwise, we say that the proposition is false. So this characterization, that of the referent by the predicate concept, could be a necessary characterization, or it could be a possible characterization. This description is called the modality of the predication, or the modality of reality. Very important concept in logic, many implications, especially in theology. But right now, just want you to keep it in mind, and we'll come back to it in a more advanced course on logic. So the thing that you should take away is that propositions, they talk about something beyond themselves. It's not just an equation of the subject concept with the predicate concept. They're not mind games. They actually talk about reality, and they're not definitions. A definition is not a proposition. Although it appears to be a proposition, a definition is not a proposition. So an example of a definition is humans are rational animals. When we define humans as being rational animals, we are saying that the concept that is referred to by the expression human is the concept that arises as a composition of the two of the genus animal and the specific difference rational. We're actually in a definition where we are saying that we are explaining what a concept is. We are explaining that the concept human is rational animal. There is no referent. We are not using the subject concept in order to get at some referent that is outside that concept. And that's why the Muslim logicians, they say that definitions are neither true nor false, because they don't describe any extra propositional reality. They just explain what a concept is. So although a definition appears to be a proposition, it's not a proposition, because it cannot be described as being true or false. So what does it mean for a proposition to be true? This is the guiding question of this lesson. We saw that a proposition is true when its predication corresponds to reality, and that it's false when its predication does not correspond to reality. What is a predication? What is a reality? What is proposition? We now understand what all of these things are. So if we step back for a moment, remember from the previous lesson that there are two kinds of propositions: categorical propositions and conditional propositions. What we've just seen applies to categorical propositions. We haven't considered conditional propositions yet. A categorical proposition asserts that the referent of the subject concept is characterized by the predicate concept. This is what we've studied so far. So we know what truth or falsehood is in reference to categorical propositions. What is truth or falsehood in relation to conditional propositions? What is a conditional proposition, first of all? So whereas a categorical proposition has a subject and predicate, a conditional proposition, it is composed of two sub-propositions, sometimes more than two sub-propositions, and it affirms or negates a connection between them. A conditional proposition asserts a relation between the truth or falsity of two categorical propositions that are sub-propositions. That relation could be a relation of conjunction, in which case it will be a conjunctive conditional proposition, or it could be a relation of disjunction, in which case it would be a disjunctive conditional proposition. Conjunction means two things coming together, being connected. Disjunction means two things being separated, disconnected. Let's take them one at a time. So an example of a conjunction, a conditional proposition that affirms a conjunctive relation is: if it is raining, then the clothes are wet. The clothes are hanging outside, and so you say, if it's raining, then the clothes are wet. This is a conditional proposition that is composed of two sub-propositions, each one of which are categorical. It consists of the categorical proposition, it is raining, and the categorical proposition, the clothes are wet. Each one of these propositions could be true or false. The goal of a conditional proposition is not to investigate whether these sub-propositions are true or false. Its goal is to say that the truth of the first entails or implies the truth of the second. So a conjunction, it affirms, a conjunctive conditional proposition asserts a asserts a connection between the truth of two propositions. It asserts that when the antecedent is true, then the consequent must also be true. So now this is something that's asserted in the proposition, and this then corresponds to reality. So if the consequent, i.e. the second proposition, is in reality, in other words, is extra propositionally implied by the antecedent, the proposition is true. So if in reality the fact that it rains entails that the clothes are wet, in reality, if that is the case, extra propositionally, in other words, then the proposition is true. Otherwise, it's false. So again, a conditional proposition, it describes an extra propositional state of affairs. It describes something outside the proposition that is the reality, and that reality is a connection between the truth of two propositions. What about a disjunctive conditional proposition? Very similar. So every number is either even or odd. This is an example of a disjunctive conditional proposition. Let's break it up into its two sub propositions. That this statement corresponds to every number is even or every number is odd. These are the two sub propositions. Each one of them is categorical. And what the disjunction is saying, that if the first is true, then the second is false. If the first is false, the second is true. If the second is true, the first is false. Second is false, the first is false. In other words, there's a disjunction. If either one of the two is true, the other one is false, and vice versa. So it's affirming this connection, this relation of disjunction between the truth or falsity of two sub-propositions. If this corresponds to reality, if in reality the truth of one proposition entails the falsity of the other and vice versa, then the proposition is true. Otherwise, it's false. So what does it mean for a proposition to be true? Well, propositions are either categorical or conditional. What it means for a categorical proposition to be true is that the referent of the subject concept is extra propositionally means in reality, characterized by the predicate concept. What it means for a conditional proposition to be true is for the conjunctive or disjunctive relation between the truth or falsity of two categorical propositions to be extra propositionally, i.e. in reality, to be the case. So in each case, there is a reality that is outside the proposition. The proposition is not merely equating to mental concepts. And this is what the logicians mean when they say that a proposition is true when its predication corresponds to reality. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم والله سبحانه وتعالى أعلم وهو حسبنا ونعم الوكيل.